always remember about the judges and representatives of the judiciary in Ukraine who are working hard every day with integrity and with dedication to their work. They will be the drivers for the future.
Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. You're listening to our special series focused on Ukraine's aspirations and challenges on its path to peace and integration into Europe. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. In this episode, we turn our attention to the judicial reforms in Ukraine, a pivotal factor in the nation's journey toward European Union membership. Reforming the judiciary has been one of the most complex but critical aspects of Ukraine's transformation since the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. I am delighted today to welcome our guest, Professor Tetyana Antsupova. Tetyana is a former judge of the Supreme Court of Ukraine, and she is also a British Academy Research Fellow at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. Now, with a wealth of experience in judicial reform and international law, Tetyana will guide us through the challenges, successes, and the broader implications of these reforms for Ukraine's future. Tetyana, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Professor Williams. Paul, if I may. I was delighted to receive your invitation and to have this opportunity to talk about the present time situation and predicted future for the Ukrainian judiciary in the context of our European Union accession aspirations. Thank you.
Well, that's fantastic. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Let's start by getting to know you a little bit better. Oh, I know you quite well since you've done so much good work with PILPG, but for our listeners to get to know you, can you walk us through a little bit your early career motivations for becoming an international lawyer and a judge and what your journey looked like?
Thank you for this question. Yes, with much pleasure, I will share my journey. Frankly speaking, the idea of becoming an international lawyer came into my mind while I was studying as an exchange student at Maryland University in the US, and one of my subjects was public international law. I suddenly realized that the learning course program is very similar to what we have studied at my Ukrainian university in Odessa. So being quite a naive young girl, I was so excited by this opening that there is a language that is the same for every nation. And being at the summit or meeting, for example, somewhere in Paris, representatives from Ireland, Africa, and Japan can easily understand each other because they speak the same language of international law. And yes, of course, actually, we can say it about any professional field or business on a private level. But all of it is only possible when peace and security are ensured by international lawyers as a precondition for peaceful cooperation. So since that time, international law and specifically European law of human rights became my Bible, so to speak, and something I truly believe in, and became part of my personal and professional identity because of the system of values I share as a person and as a professional. And to become a judge, the second part of your question, to become a judge of the Supreme Court, again, was a call of my idealistic nature. The reform of the judiciary in 2016 was requested by society after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, as you know. And among other ambitions, I had a personal ambitious goal to bring international law into the motivation of judgments of the Supreme Court. And of course, it is a long and evolutionary process to develop and improve legal culture. And it is the judge's discretion to refer to the sources of international law in the particular case where he or she finds it relevant. But nevertheless, every step toward this is important. And I'm proud we launched the annual conference co-organized by the Supreme Court and the Ukrainian Association of International Law, dedicated to different aspects of public and private international law. Essentially, it is a regular dialogue between judges and academicians, which is highly important in Ukraine because of our Soviet heritage. And our Soviet heritage is that social science, including legal studies, have been living their separate lives apart from legal practice. So this interaction is valuable for mutual inspiration. And talking about my career as judge, another achievement which I'm proud of was that in cooperation with our colleagues from Canada, we designed a training program on legal writing and structure of judgments for the Supreme Court judges, which helps to make a judgment more clear, logical, and understandable for the different groups of readers. So that pretty much was my motivation to become a judge in 2017.
Well, Tetyana, I have to say, I really appreciate you and your colleagues' efforts to make judicial decisions understandable. When I teach law school, I always tell my students, no, we're actually learning how to write things more simple than we learned. I learned at university. Law school is all about you want someone to understand what it is you're arguing, or if you're a judge, what it is you decided. And it sounds like you took quite an international approach to developing your understanding of international law, studying in the United States, working with your Canadian counterparts, and pulling together the best and the brightest of the Ukrainian young minds to begin that process of reforming the judiciary. Can you walk us through a little bit the significance of judicial reform in Ukraine? Was this a few tweaks here and there? Was it a modern upgrade? Or was it a substantial overhaul given the old Soviet socialist system and the desire to make it more of a contemporary system? And how important is that reform in the context of Ukraine's aspirations to accede to the European Union?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And yes, everyone call it reforms, judicial reforms, even in the context of the European Union accession. And let's call them reforms, of course. But I would rather call these changes improvements or capacity building of the judiciary, because in my understanding, the term reforms is when we change something fundamentally. And with Ukraine, the story is that the foundation of the system of justice and system of courts was made already in 2016 when the comprehensive judicial reform were represented. And the only thing that needs the judiciary is tweaking, improving, updating, and correct navigation on the pathway to the European Union and beyond. And the direct answer to your question, why it is significant, is simple, because every associated country of Central and Eastern Europe seeking to become a member of the European Union should meet the Copenhagen criteria. And these criteria were laid down by the European Council in 1993. And these are fundamental conditions for any candidate country include the stability of institutions guaranteeing democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and respect for and protection of minorities. And obviously, rule of law is one of the founding principles of the European Union. For Ukraine, ensuring an independent, impartial, and effective judiciary is crucial, not only to protect individual rights, but also to secure the trust of European Union institutions and member states in our democratic trajectory. And capacity building plays a central role in combating corruption, which is a precondition for deeper integration with the EU, including access to funding and participation in the EU internal market. Also, the EU acquis communautaire requires member states to have a judiciary that can effectively implement and enforce EU law. Reforms ensure that Ukraine's legal and judicial institutions are structurally and functionally capable and compatible with EU standards. And last but not least, the EU also looks at the trust of society in public institutions as an indicator of democratic health. And the European Commission, identified judicial reform as one of 7 priority steps Ukraine must undertake to advance toward membership. And the progress in this area, so to speak, is constantly monitored and reflected in the European Commission enlargement reports on Ukraine. We had already 2 such reports in 2023 and 2024.
Well, Tetyana, that sounds like a fairly comprehensive set of issues for Ukraine to upgrade and to evolve with respect to its judiciary, and all very much in a highly positive direction towards independence, impartialness, effectiveness, utilization of the rule of law, and trust in institutions. And I guess this next question is a little bit of a two-parter question, which is, can you give us an overview of the progress that Ukraine has made so far in this quote unquote reform of its judiciary? What are some of the key focus areas? And is this reform aligning with the potential fast track membership of Ukraine into the European Union as part of the whole peace process designed to bring an end to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine? Are those timelines aligned, or can they be aligned?
Yeah, you're right. It is a part of the previous question. And according to the latest assessment from the European Commission, Ukraine is making the progress. And the main focus was made on recommendations after obtaining the candidate status in June 2022. The priorities were to finalize the integrity vetting of the candidates for the High Council of Justice members by the Ethics Council, and the selection of candidates to establish the High Qualification Commission of Judges of Ukraine, and enacting and implementing legislation on a selection procedure for judges of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. At present, 2 judges of the Constitutional Court have been already appointed according to a new procedure with participation of international experts in this selective procedure. And 5 candidates are in the procedure of appointment. It will let the Constitutional Court to overcome the absence of quorum and unblock its work. At present, the main governing bodies of the judiciary function after a long break. The High Council of Justice was unable to work due a lack of quorum from the end of February 2022. It returned to work in January 2023. The High Qualification Commission of Judges stopped functioning at the end of 2019, almost for a period of 4 years. And in June 2023, it resumed. And in the last year's enlargement report, the European Commission stated that there is a clearer emphasis of improving judicial independence through strengthened cooperation between Ukraine's High Qualification Commission of Judges and the Public Integrity Council. Public Integrity Council is a special body which helps High Qualification Commission to select judges and in vetting process. So the European Commission noticed that they are making progress within understanding between 2 bodies, because it was rather problematic in the past. And I would underline that in many ways, the Ukrainian judiciary has achieved significant progress. The most advanced and transparent qualification procedures for judges in Europe, I would say, have been established. And civil society, as I mentioned, and international experts are involved in the selection and vetting procedures for judges. And the formal side of this question is that Ukraine is an active member of the European Commission for the Efficiency of Justice and the Consultative Council of European Judges, which are bodies of the Council of Europe. And in 2023, Ukraine received observer status in the European Network of Councils for the Judiciary. It was a very important and symbolic, I would say, step, this consolidation within the European networks for judiciaries, especially during a full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine.
Tetyana, I have to say, I'm a little surprised, and I imagine our listeners are surprised at how many different entities and organizations there are for judicial collaboration, judicial capacity building, sharing of best practices among the judicial branches throughout Europe. So that's very encouraging to hear that there are other, we always hear about the Venice Commission in part because I think we all want to go on Venice, want to go to Venice on vacation, but we always know about what the Venice Commission is doing to help countries figure out constitutional issues. But I hadn't realized there was such a plethora of judicial commissions and institutions to provide mutual support. Let me ask a more of a nuts and bolts question. We talk about the European Commission playing a role in monitoring and in reporting. You've also talked a little bit about both Ukrainian and international civil society and experts. How does the Commission work with the Ukrainian judges and Ukrainian political actors to implement judicial reform? Do they sit together elbow by elbow and discuss drafts and discuss changes, or do they simply lay out the acquis and then monitor and report on it? And that's sort of one question: is the European bureaucratic infrastructure, to what degree does it sit shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainians? And then the second is involving Ukrainian and international experts and civil society. How does that play out? Most countries are reluctant to have, civil society stands on the street and shouts and writes reports. Most countries don't invite civil society into the building to help them out. Walk us through how that's playing out in Ukraine and if that's a model for future efforts of judicial reform around the globe.
Yes, thank you. And thank you. Let me reflect to the previous question, because you mentioned Venice Commission, and Venice Commission indeed played a crucial role in judicial reforms in Ukraine, and with all its reports and opinions and guiding the Ukraine on this passage. And it is one of the institutions of the Council of Europe as well. So the Council of Europe indeed is a school of democracy for Ukraine, with no doubt. And moving to your next question concerning the role of the European Union and European Commission and through what instruments it helps Ukraine, I should say that the role of the European Union and Commission as a part of it is to guide Ukraine in its judiciary reforms, considering the previous enlargement experience. And the EU technical support is important, and it is implemented through different initiatives and working groups. As you said, how it works in practice, do they sit around the table? Yes, sometimes they do. And for example, there is a huge project, Private Justice, which is the largest European Union initiative to support the reform of the Ukrainian judiciary. And they work closely with Ukrainian judiciary, self-governing bodies, with the courts, discussing, and they are helping with the drafting roadmap, and in everyday challenges and everyday questions and issues, they are very actively supporting. And if we are speaking generally about the support of the EU, then one of the pillars of the Ukraine Facility Plan, which entered into force in March 2024, and covers the years from 24 to 27. So one of the pillars is capacity building of the institutions on national, regional, and local levels. And it is an instrument within the European Union's strategy to address the multi-faced challenges confronting Ukraine in the wake of Russia's war of aggression. This dedicated support mechanism, which offers up to 50 billion in stable and predictable financial support. And the key objectives of the plan are to support recovery, reconstruction, and modernization, support reforms on the way to EU accession, support financing needs and mobilize investments, and support Ukrainian society. And moving to your second part of the question about an international experts and civil society involved into selection and vetting process, it was pretty much a part of building the trust and confidence in the judiciary since the Revolution of Dignity, because, as I mentioned, it was a request of society for, so to speak, cleaning and self-cleaning the system of judiciary after the Revolution of Dignity and after the issue which got observed about dependence of particular judges on administration. So that's why the civil society is so actively involved into this building of trust. And at some stage, to build trust of international partners, the idea of involvement international experts became on the stage. That's why, that's what the reason. But recently, I conducted an interview with the judge of the European Court of Human Rights within the project I am leading at the BICL, British Institute of International and Comparative Law. So it was a video interview, and one of the questions was about actually the impact of international experts on capacity building of Ukrainian judiciary. So the opinion of the judge, Adamska, who was a part of Private Justice Project for many years, and she knows the Ukrainian context very much. She said that, yes, it is a very positive idea and move, but at some stage, Ukraine should take responsibility for activities of its judicial bodies and their independence in decision making. And yeah, it is good as a temporary measure.
Yeah, no, Tetyana, that's the nice thing about international experts. You can invite them to come and provide some guidance and assistance and share some best practices, and then you can ask them to leave. They can add value for a period of time and then move on. I think oftentimes, as you seem to be alluding to, the international community comes and sets up shop and stays for quite a while. So that's the fact that Ukraine is quite aware and quite intent on tapping international expertise for judicial reform and then moving it over to 100% Ukrainian expertise after a moderate period of time. That's a good guiding principle and a good lesson learned for our audience to put into their heads. Let me move to a more precise question about the impact of the ongoing Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and how that has impacted the pace and priorities of judicial reforms. And one thing that I'm deeply engaged in, and I know you're deeply engaged in as well, is the effort of Ukraine to prosecute domestically those that are involved in the Russian war of aggression, committing atrocity crimes, committing ecocide, committing environmental war crimes. And in our work with prosecutors and judges at PILPG, we've seen that there's a huge degree of energy and effort, but also a really deep commitment to figuring out how to apply international humanitarian law, war crimes, atrocity crimes, prevention law to what's happening in Ukraine. And when I first met with some of the prosecutors, they say, we're really good at prosecuting people. We've prosecuted our entire lives. We've never prosecuted an atrocity crime. You have. Walk us through how we do that. and then leave because we're going to take it on from there. So we've seen, in a sense, Ukraine developing a huge amount of precedent and insight and tactical and strategic approaches to prosecuting these really difficult crimes. Are there other impacts in the Ukrainian judicial system, either positive like that or maybe negative, relating to failure to access all territory or strain on resources?
Yeah, thank you for that example, for that positive, so to speak, example, Paul. But let me start by saying that our main priority is to save the country and its sovereignty. You would expect that all the judicial reforms have slowed down, but they are not. And talking about the, again, capacity building and how the system works during times of war, as of March 12, 2025, 142 court buildings were destroyed, which is 18% of the total, around 800 buildings. So they have been damaged or completely destroyed. And there are 138 courts located in territories temporarily not under Ukrainian governmental control. Between February 22 and December 24, 145 courts ceased operations and their territorial jurisdiction was changed. Of those, 29 courts later resumed their work. So, to provide an access to justice is a challenge. And as I said, just to save the country and its sovereignty is an everyday priority. But the uniqueness of this situation is that priority to become a member of the European Union has not changed as well and became even stronger. So we should fulfill the recommendations of the European Commission regardless of the war. However, significant uncertainty remains regarding a special pathway for Ukraine's EU membership, given that Ukraine simultaneously struggled to defend European values on the front line. And my notice from the last year statements made during the press conference by High Representative, Vice President of the European Commission on the 2024 enlargement package in November last year. It revealed no indications on steps toward, as you said, fast-track accession process for Ukraine. So it was pretty much fast-track for the candidate status, but then the accession process is absolutely the same as for the other candidate states. And in my view, the Ukrainian judiciary can be an inspiring example for our European partners. It has shown remarkable dedication, ensuring access to justice and improving the digitalization of justice even during wartime. Likewise, other public officials and civil servants continue to serve with integrity. The Ukrainian tragedy shows that the acquisition of democracy cannot be taken for granted. Hopefully, it will make all Europeans reassured in their values and keep them united. And obviously, upholding justice and democracy in the country in conditions of active hostilities is an everyday fight. It put judges under terrible pressure. However, we should admit that the remarkable resilience is there. And as you said, being under that pressure, they still should learn how to consider absolutely new categories of cases like atrocity crimes. And that's why the role of international law is so important. And there are many partners who are providing help and support within the European Union, and the United Kingdom is a part of this process. I mean, I'm talking now about the training for judges, for criminal court judges, to provide them with the expertise and knowledge about international humanitarian law, its sources, and how to apply them in particular war crimes cases. So we can always see the positive and the negative in the same activities.
It sounds like despite the fact of the Russian war of aggression, there's so much activity that's continuing with judicial reform in Ukraine, and that the energy and the enthusiasm and the intellectual capability are clearly there on the part of the Ukrainians. And then there's quite a bit of international support, which is very heartening. Are there any central challenges that Ukraine has faced in this process? Other challenges related to the war of aggression, or just the challenges for any country making a judicial transition or judicial transformation that you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, you're right. I think any, especially post-Soviet new democracies, countries of Eastern and Central Europe, they have their challenges in realizing, implementing reforms, and some systemic and structural deficiencies, so to speak. And in my view, in Ukrainian reality, inconsistent reforms of the judiciary are one of the central challenges. Unfortunately, despite the request of society, as I said, after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, and the good intentions and political will, and the bright start of the comprehensive reform in 2016, which transformed the four-level court system into three-level court system, which brought new changes to the procedural codes and many, many other changes for better. But unfortunately, all of it stopped or even collapsed in 2019. And one of the reforms of the judiciary was initiated by the judiciary itself in Ukraine. The changes were always caused by political motives, imposed from outside, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not. And as underlined by the Venice Commission, which you mentioned, following presidential elections, the new political power would often start new changes to the judicial system. This is the political aspect. Another central issue is non-enforcement of final judicial decisions, which was identified by the European Court of Human Rights as a systemic issue, systemic problem in two cases, actually, in Yuri Nikolaevich Ivanov against Ukraine and others against Ukraine in 2009 and 2017, respectively. So partly this issue was caused by populistic laws promising social benefits to the electorate with limited budgetary capacity. And of course, the war didn't change the situation for better, obviously. And another systemic issue is trust and confidence in judiciary and independence of judiciary. Compared to the 2 years ago report, the same message remains in the last year report of the European Commission, and it says that overall the constitution and legislation guarantee the independence of the judiciary, but certain shortcomings persist in law and in practice. Business associations still raise concerns about the judiciary and corruption as obstacles to doing business in Ukraine. The renewed judicial governance bodies need to continue their work alongside other measures to effectively improve the independence, impartiality, and accountability of the judiciary and restore public trust in it, which remains very low. And there are some corruption scandals which didn't change the situation for better, and the European Commission also mentioned that the corruption risks in the Supreme Court still need to be addressed. So I would say these are the main directions which we should work on together with civil society, actually, because it is a mutual understanding and mutual work that populistic slogans are not raising in any way confidence and trust in the judiciary. And there are thousands and thousands of judges who are working with integrity and who are dedicated to their work in every day.
There's no simple day than the day in the life of a judge.
Yeah.
Let me pull the screen out a little bit larger now and ask, when Ukraine started and is undertaking these efforts at reform, and they've looked around Europe or maybe more broadly throughout the globe, have they identified other countries that have faced, I want to say similar challenges, but Ukraine is facing so many challenges at the moment, in particular with Russia's war of aggression. Are there other countries that have experienced some of the challenges that Ukraine has been facing and that Ukraine has looked to for guidance or simply for comparative state practice as to how those countries have dealt with judicial reform? Or is the situation highly unique and you simply have assembled a team of domestic and international experts and colleagues from the European Commission to help you think through it?
Yes, this is an important question, which is actually a part of the research plan within the project I'm leading at the BICO as well. And yes, we can say that Ukraine is a unique example of polycrisis, considering that we went through the COVID challenge and then before the revolution, before the COVID, I mean the revolution, and then the full-scale invasion and active hostilities. So I hardly can find any other country in Europe which would have such a background. But from the last enlargement experience in 2004, if we are talking about the recent member states of the European Union, we have 3 former Soviet republics, which are Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, 4 former satellites of the USSR, which are Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia, and a former Yugoslav republic, Slovenia, and 2 Mediterranean islands. So, of course, it is very important to learn the mistakes and to learn the lessons of other countries which went through this experience of joining the EU. And I think there are some experiences we can take into account. For example, Slovakia made significant progress through judicial self-governance reform and transparent appointments guided by the European Union. Romania established the National Integrity Agency and specialized anti-corruption courts to meet European Union expectations. And in Ukraine, we already have the high anti-corruption court and all the system of related bodies. Despite creating anti-corruption institutions, Bulgaria, for example, struggled with enforcement and public trust, leading the European Union to establish the cooperation and verification mechanism. Croatia implemented extensive judicial training and re-evaluation procedures for judges, improving public trust and judicial independence. Estonia, for example, its digital experience and digital judiciary and e-justice tools set a European benchmark for transparent and efficient courts. And in my opinion, genuine political will, coordination of efforts, and involvement of all branches of state power are crucial for Ukraine. And for judiciary, strategy could help with implementing a systemic approach and planning consistently. It could also reduce the pressure on the judiciary. And I know that there is a, so to speak, tradition that the presidential office is working on this strategy. But I think that judiciary should take a leading role in the future on this. So thank you.
Tetyana, let me pick up on the future, and you've been very generous with your time, so I just have 2 more questions for you. But looking towards the future, Ukraine is well on its way to completing its reform of the judiciary. Ideally, there will be a resolution of Russia's war of aggression in the coming months, if not within this year. And then what do you see as the priorities for the Ukrainian judiciary once it's reformed, once the war has come to a conclusion? It doesn't magically go to, peace and prosperity. There's still going to be a lot of work to do in terms of physical reconstruction, but also legal reconstruction and integration and things you mentioned earlier, protection of minority rights, protection of human rights. What do you see as the priorities for the Ukrainian judiciary post-conflict?
Thank you for this question. And I partly started to answer it in my previous remarks. I think that Ukrainian judiciary needs stability. This is the most important thing the Ukrainian judiciary needs. And this stability could be partly ensured by adopting a strategy for the judiciary. I'm I believe that such strategies should contribute, especially in new democracy countries, should contribute to the stable development of judicial systems and maintain constitutional continuity. And in Ukrainian realities, I think 10 years' time, like in Sweden, for example, in Sweden, they have the judicial strategy for 10 years. It would be very desirable period of predictable and stable future for the judiciary to plan and to understand what is our final destination, what we would like to achieve, what we would like to improve. Because again, joining the European Union is just the beginning of work. We should work on studying languages. We should work on understanding and applying the sources of European Union law. There is a huge, huge amount of work for judges and judiciary bodies to understand a totally new legal system, which is European Union law. And I should mention that only the new generation of lawyers started to learn this learning course, the European Union law, at universities. And the previous generations of judges and representatives of the judiciary, they didn't. So it's all about self-education, and which means lots of training work, lots of planning, again, which I hope can be ensured by the strategy for the judiciary. And of course, building of trust and confidence in the judiciary and support by civil society. And as well, important, the understanding of where we're going and what we are doing. It is important in coordination with executive and legislative branches, with no danger for independence for the judiciary.
Well, Tetyana, you've been very generous with your time. I just have one last question now, and that is, what is the key takeaway that you want our listeners to remember and to think about when it comes to the quote unquote reform of the Ukrainian judiciary, and what might be relevant or applicable to the work that they're likely be doing in their countries as domestic experts or judges, or in other countries if they're playing the role of an international expert? What is it that they really have to know and to remember?
I think it is very important to remember that despite, different propaganda or disinformation, or even very unpleasant information about corruption scandals or something that's going wrong in Ukraine, I think you should always remember about the judges and that representatives of the judiciary in Ukraine who are working hard every day with integrity and with dedication to their work. Think about them and try to support and to do everything you can to support that judges, because they will be the drivers for the future. They will be the drivers for the future positive changes for the judiciary and the country as such. And we should invest our time and efforts into support of that people. And there are vast majority of them in Ukraine, believe you me. Thank you.
No, thanks, Tetyana. That's a great reminder that behind every rule of law infrastructure, there are people. And as you say, the judges get up every day and go to work, and there's something new and different that they have to work on. They're people, they're operating in a time of war, of conflict, and of great stress, but they're building something amazing for the democratic Ukraine and the future durability and stability of the peace, which will come about hopefully in the very near future. Well, Tetyana, it's been a huge honor and a privilege for me to have this conversation with you. I've known you now for a number of years, and you've always been such an enthusiastic engager and colleague on the various working groups and activities that PILPG has undertaken to provide short-term international assistance and capacity building with our Ukrainian friends. And you've been a phenomenal colleague to work with throughout all of those efforts. And this past hour has been really great for myself and for our listeners to hear about how much progress has been made with judicial reform in Ukraine and the challenges that lie ahead. And I think it's an inspirational story, both for us that care about Ukraine and also for those of us who care about the rule of law and the very unique and important role that the judiciary plays in promoting durable and sustainable peace. So, Tetyana, thank you very much for joining us for this conversation.
Thanks again, dear Paul, for inviting me, and it was my pleasure. And thank you for caring about Ukraine and reforms in Ukraine and our future. Thank you for your support.